Welcome back, brothers, to Amalur. Tonight, we're diving into a theory on what if Perturabo would stay loyal during the Siege of Terra. Before we get into madness, be sure to like, comment any videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor. I want to thank you guys for the support. I've been killing it. Now, let's get into the madness.
Before the traitor host came in full, before the first world of the Sol system was drowned in the smoke of bombardment and the blood of boarding actions, Terra had already become a wound too vast for any sky to cover. Its horizons were no longer horizons. They were ramparts. Its mountains had been cored and girdled in gun citadels. Its plains had been flensed into trench continents, ridge after ridge of revetments, redoubts, anti-armor ditches, razor-wire fields, mine belts, and ferrocrete galleries buried beneath leagues of churned mud and blackened ice. Void shield pylons rose in long files like the vertebrae of a dead god pushed up through the crust. Macro batteries sat in armored crowns upon bastions the size of hive districts, each cannon big enough to hurl cathedral-weight shells into the upper airs. Orbital plates hung above the throne world like slabs of dark iron, weapon-studded and cold, and beneath them the palace spread across the poisoned cradle of old Terra as something too immense to be called a fortress, and too murderous to be called a city. Men died building it. Men died feeding it. Men died to make space for it. A caste Varn had learned that in the first month, and ceased learning anything cleaner thereafter. He stood upon a command walk, cut into the side of a battlement, newly plated in ceramite and heat-black iron, staring down over labor camps arranged in perfect geometric misery. Hundreds of thousands of workers moved below in chained columns under the sweep of lumen towers and the watch of gun servitors. Corpses lay stacked where the shifts changed, stripped of boots and belts before the flesh carts took them. Priests in soot-dark vestments daubed warding oils on shell hoists. Skitari cohorts tramped past in exact cadence, their augmetic limbs clicking like tools in a coffin drawer. Farther out, where the land had once been districts and roads and places where men had lived with some remnant of private existence, there were only trenches, demolition scars, and the patient stink of fresh graves. The vox bead in Varn's ear rasped with static. Then the controller's voice broke through, thin with awe. Contact in upper anchor, multiple transponder streams, Legionese Astartes pattern, identification confirms. The Iron Warriors have translated. Varn did not answer at once. He looked up. The day was a yellow bruise under the smog shell. For a moment he saw nothing but the dirty light and the crawling clouds of exhaust rising from the palace manufactoria. Then points of fire stitched the heavens. They came in ordered spears, not the riot of panicked traffic or the noble procession of a triumphal fleet. They came with the measured malice of artillery, heavy hulls, siege barges, battlecraft broad as cities. Their flanks were iron grey and brass trimmed, austere in profile, built to endure punishment and return it with interest. Their engine wash burned lanes through the upper haze as they descended into holding, patterns above the palace districts. Around Varn, soldiers made the sign of the Aquila. Others did not. The name of the legion passed from mouth to mouth in a mutter less like prayer than rumor at an execution. Iron Warriors. Even on loyal Terra, the name was spoken as if it might corrode the tongue. The landing was conducted without spectacle. No banners, no blaring hymns, no orchestrated declaration of fealty. Great assault rams and armored landers punched down through the shield corridors and settled on the basalt aprons of the western military precincts, while the palace guns tracked them as though daring one false code. The first ranks to emerge were legionaries in iron-grey plate striped in hazard black, helms expressionless, bolters mag-locked, movement disciplined to the point of insult. They spread in exact arcs, establishing fields of fire before their primarch had yet shown his face. Behind them came siege automata, tracked ordnance haulers, servitor chains, adepts, bearing cogitator coffers, and ranks of mortal auxilia, whose eyes were already dead with obedience. Then Perturabo descended. He did not stride as Sanguinius strode, nor blaze as the angel blazed. He came down the assault ramp like a slab of war given motion, broad as a bunker door, his armor the color of old iron veined with hazard markings and chevron sigils. Servo arms rose behind him in a steel corona. His face was pale granite, made animate by contempt alone. There was no glory upon him. There was weight. One looked upon Rogel Dawn and saw a wall. One looked upon Perturabo and saw the guns that reduced walls to gravel and men to red vapor. Varn had seen picked captures of Primarchs before. Nothing in any sanctioned archive had prepared him for the pressure of being in the same world space as one. It was as if some titanic engine of cognition had entered the air, and every lesser mind had to grind its teeth to keep from being crushed flat by the sheer certainty of his existence. "Make way!" barked an Iron Warrior's centurion, whose left pauldron bore the iconography of a siege-breaker cadre. His voice was flat, metallic through the helm grill. "All non-essential personnel clear the transit line. Any obstruction will be removed." No one asked what removed meant. Varn obeyed with the rest. Perturabo passed within 30 paces of him, and did not so much as turn his head, yet Varn had the sick certainty that he had been weighed and filed in the Primarch's mind as one more expendable function among 10,000 other moving parts. By the time Varn was summoned to the inner strategium, the reunion of brothers had already begun. The chamber had been carved beneath the palace foundations and armored against everything short of direct apocalypse. Hololithic theaters floated above black iron projectors. Segment maps of Terra and Luna hung in layers of light, overlaid with gun arcs, supply lines, tunnel routes, orbital defense lattices, and casualty. Estimates already so vast that the numerals looked like prayers to extinction. Custodians stood in absolute stillness at the chamber's edges, gold-armored and unreadable. Constantine Valdor was among them, spear grounded, his face as hard as judgment withheld. Malcador the Sigillite stood near the central table with his staff braced in one thin hand, age hanging on him like a burial shroud wrapped around a flame that refused to gutter. Rogel Dawn faced the entrance in Auramite and Storm Shadow Yellow, his expression unadorned by any pretense of fraternal warmth. Perturabo entered, and the air chilled further. Dawn broke the silence first. "You came." Perturabo's gaze moved over the hololiths, the bastion overlays, the projected defense depths. "You required correction." Several officers flinched as though struck. Dawn did not. "These defenses will hold," he said. Perturabo came to the main display, studied the palace rings, the outer trench seas, the mercury, battlements, the shield web, the artillery nests, the reserve concentrations. When he spoke, his voice was low and utterly without haste. "They are magnificent. They are also wasteful." Dawn's jaw tightened a fraction. "Explain." "You built for endurance and statement. You built walls to be seen from orbit. You built bastions to embody defiance. You built lines that impress the eye of a brother and the vanity of chroniclers." Perturabo looked up at him then, and in that glance was a lifetime of old poison. A wall exists to kill. If it seeks admiration, it has already failed its function. One of Dawn's captains stepped half a pace forward, outrage rising, but a single turn of Dawn's hand stilled him. "The palace was not raised to satisfy vanity," Dawn said. "It was raised to hold against any assault." "Then why," Perturabo asked, "are so many of your outer works designed to be defended to the point of pointless loss, rather than abandoned to draw the enemy where he can be annihilated? Why are your artillery depths too shallow in the western sectors? Why do your countermines follow the logic of preservation instead of collapse? Why are there districts beyond the principal kill belts that have not yet been emptied, mined, and poisoned?" Dawn stared at him. "Because there are still citizens in those districts." "There are munitions in those districts," Perturabo said. "There are avenues of approach, hab masses that may conceal breach points. water reserves that may be taken, roofscapes fit for gun nests, sub-levels fit for tunneling, and millions of bodies that will either be moved now by our will or butchered later by the enemies. Malcador spoke before Dawn could answer. You arrive and within moments advocate the sacrifice of imperial populations on the throne world itself. You understand why trust is not abundant. Perturabo gave the sigillite a glance as brief and cold as a knife edge. I understand that sentiment is a luxury good, and that terror is too poor to purchase it. Valdor's voice entered the chamber like a blade being drawn. And why should the master of mankind entrust such decisions to you, Lord of Iron? At that, the room became so still that Varn could hear the hololithic emitters whining. Perturabo did not bristle. That would have been human. He simply turned his head slightly toward the Captain General. Because no one here, he said, understands siege mathematics as I do. Not you, not Malcador, not even Dawn, for all his talent in fortification. He knows how to make a wall stand. I know how worlds die against one. Malcador lifted a hand. A servo skull drifted forward, carrying a narrow casket of auramite and black lacquer. The sigillite opened it and withdrew a sealed strip of metallum foil inscribed with sigils that hurt the eyes if stared at too long. When he broke the seal, something passed through the chamber that was not light and not sound, but every soul present felt it. Varn dropped to one knee before he knew he was doing it. His teeth hurt. Tears sprang, unbidden, to his eyes. The custodians did not move, but the edges of their auramite seemed suddenly brighter, as though reflecting a sun no mortal retina could survive. The sanction of the throne. Malcador read in a voice made small by the authority it carried. By the will of the master of mankind, Perturabo, Primarch of the Iron Warriors, is granted latitude in the prosecution of the outer defense, the ordination of siege geometries, the reallocation of artillery assets, and the disposition of sacrificial works deemed necessary to the survival of the imperial palace and the continuity of the great project. Dawn's eyes never left his brother. Perturabo inclined his head once. It was not gratitude, it was acceptance. Then hear my first command, he said. Empty the western Hab districts to the bedrock. Any who cannot be moved by dusk are to be sealed below. Demolition charges in every transit artery. Rad munitions prepared for reservoir contamination on my signal. The old manufactoria belts will be converted into deadfall corridors. I want fortress rails cut beneath the tertiary lines and ammunition crawlers moving before the next rotation. The trenches east of the Delphic Rise are to be widened and tiered. I want the fields there to drink armor in mud before they ever touch wire. Outer bastions, 17 through 23, will be refitted as sacrificial anchors. Dawn's voice cracked across the room. No. Perturabo turned fully toward him now. No. You will not condemn millions merely to perfect a theorem. What do you believe a siege is? Perturabo asked. He did not raise his voice, but suddenly everyone else in the chamber seemed far away. Do you think this is a matter of stone and banners, and who can stand the longer at a parapet? This is arithmetic written in marrow. This is the division of hunger against ammunition, fear against discipline, mass against fire. If those districts remain, they become shelter for the enemy and grave pits for the innocent. If they are rendered lethal now, they become time. Time is what stands between terror and the knife. Dawn stepped toward him, and the two Primarchs seemed for one impossible instant like continental plates pressing together. You would murder terror to save terror. Perturabo's expression did not alter. I would decide which part of terror must die, so the throne does not. No one spoke after that. The orders went out within the hour. Varn received his in the Western Reclamation Quarter from an Iron Warriors officer named Keir Valen, a centurion whose armor bore the impact scars of 100 sieges, and whose voice made all human protest feel childish by comparison. They stood on an elevated transit line overlooking hab blocks that had once housed several million souls. Columns of refugees were already moving under whip, gun, and litany toward the interior labor pens. Those too weak to keep pace stumbled under the crush. Behind them came servitor gangs, lugging coiled demolition wire, toxin canisters, mine casings, and racks of pressure charges. "You will supervise the clearance of sectors ash through Sepulchre," Valen said. He placed a data slate into Vaughn's shaking hands. "Priority is sub-level denial. Collapse transit tunnels, silence power grids, brick service shafts, flood the old cisterns with caustics, then lace the avenue mouths with buried melter charges. Any hab cluster that cannot be emptied by the marked hour is to be shut in and annotated for later ignition." Vaughn stared at the slate. There are still workers in the lower manufactoria, civilians, families. Valen regarded him through the black eye lenses of his helm. "There are functions. There are obstructions. Learn the difference." "Centurion," Vaughn said, and hated how thin his own voice sounded. "Some of these sectors are inside our own fallback depth." "Correct," said Valen. "When the line retreats, those sectors will kill for us. The Primarch has no interest in territory that does not consume the foe." Below them, a crowd broke. Someone had seen the mine layers. Panic went through the evacuees like current through a wet wire. Men screamed. A line of militia opened fire over their heads. It did nothing. The crush became a riot, then a slaughter. Shot bodies vanished underfoot. A child no older than 10 standard years climbed a barricade and was thrown back by the butt of a rifle. An overseer was dragged down and torn apart with bare hands before a servitor heavy stubber traversed and sprayed the mob into red collapse. Vaughn looked away. "Do not avert your eyes," said Valen. "You serve the Lord of Iron now. Witness is part of service." So Vaughn witnessed. He watched hab blocks emptied by flamers when the stairwells jammed. He watched adepts hammer shrine doors shut, with worshippers still screaming inside, because the crypt beneath had been selected for a collapse chamber. He watched corpse wagons overturned into trenches to create revetments from the dead. He watched medici stations stripped of the salvageable wounded and mined with the unsalvageable still strapped to their cots. He watched poison pumped into underhive reservoirs until the water foamed green and black. He signed the order that sealed a rail shelter, whose lower decks had not been fully cleared because the demolition train was already behind schedule, and the Iron Warriors did not recognize delay as a moral category. By nightfall, the Western Quarter had ceased to resemble part of a capital and become instead a loaded weapon whose trigger the Primarch alone intended to pull. Dawn came to see it himself. Vaughn was on a gun terrace above the gutted district when the Praetorian arrived with an escort of Imperial fists, their yellow plate dusted white with masonry ash. Perturabo was already there, studying the transformed quarter through magnocular optics, as if examining a completed engine. Beneath them, the emptied habs were dark, windowless cavities. Entire avenues had been broken open and packed with explosive charge webs. Trenches intersected old civic roads in killing angles so precise they seemed drawn with a surgeon's blade. Tower blocks had been hollowed and cross-braced to collapse inward on command. The old manufactoria chimneys vented toxin smoke in slow green ribbons. Dawn took it in, and his face turned to carved stone. "This is barbarity," he said. Perturabo did not lower the magnoculars. "It is preparation. You have created a charnel maze behind our own lines. I have created depth. You have slaughtered citizens under the walls of the palace." Perturabo handed the optics to an Iron Warrior's aide and turned. "Do not posture for me, Rogel. You know exactly what comes for. Terror. You know what Horus will bring. If you still pretend there is a clean road through this war, then it is not I who misunderstand siegecraft." Dawn's fists clenched. "There must remain a line." "There is," Perturabo said. "The line is the Eternity Gate. Everything before it is material. The hatred in Dawn's stare then was an old thing, older than the heresy, older even perhaps than either of them wished to admit. Yet he looked again over the district, over the kill corridors, the pre-sighted artillery depths, the layered demolitions, and some harder knowledge moved behind his eyes. Not acceptance, never that. Recognition. Far away, deep within the palace, the great alarm bells began to toll. Every head turned upward. The sky had darkened not with weather, but with war. Through breaks in the smog shell, Varn saw lines of fire crossing the heavens in such numbers that the night itself seemed to be splitting open. Orbital defense batteries awakened across, terror in chained salvos. Macro shells roared upward, leaving incandescent scars in the cloud layers. Shield harmonics boomed over the palace like the striking of impossible gongs. From every trench line, tower, bunker mouth, and chapel loudspeaker came the same rising howl of sirens, warnings, battle cant, and vox distortion, all of it swelling until prayer could no longer be heard beneath it. On the strategium channels, the reports came in fragments and screams. Contact at Luna, contact above the ecliptic, boarding actions in the outer anchorages, enemy mass beyond counting, traitor transponders confirmed, Sons of Horus, Death Guard, World Eaters, Word Bearers, engines of the Dark Mechanicum, distortions in the void, warp bloom signatures, kill estimates already obsolete. Somewhere beyond sight, beyond the shield lattice and the gun decks and the last thin veil of atmosphere, Horus Lupercal had been informed that Perturabo had not come to kneel. Those who stood near the War Master later said he took the report in silence. They said his face did not contort with fury, nor did he cast down goblets, nor spend rage in theatrics. He merely looked toward terror, hanging blue and white, and wounded in the black. Abaddon stood beside him, waiting for the order to begin the murder of worlds. The bridge crew did not breathe. At length Horus said, "Then the throne world will not merely resist, it will think." On Terra, the Lord of Iron watched the upper dark ignite. The first wrecks were already falling, burning through the atmosphere as torn stars, their trails reflected in the poisoned clouds. Around Varn, men dropped to their knees. Others cheered, others wept. The bells kept tolling, the guns kept speaking. Every fortress on Terra seemed to draw breath at once. Perturabo's face was lit by the red of descending fire. "At last," he said, and there was no triumph in it, only certainty. "Now we begin." The war in the void began as geometry, and became butchery with such speed that mortal thought could scarcely keep pace with the transition. For a little while, there was only order. That was the most terrible thing a cast Varn would later remember of those first days above Terra. Not the screams piped down the command channels from burning decks, not the images of men blown out into hard vacuum with their entrails freezing in coils of crimson frost, not even the Vox records of boarding alarms choked off mid-prayer. It was the order, the inhuman mathematical stillness with which Perturabo received each report, shifted each squadron marker, sacrificed each watch station, and turned the whole solar war into an abacus made of moons, orbital bastions, mine clouds, and lives counted only in the utility of their expenditure. The Lord of Iron took command of great swathes of the void defense, not as a courtly commander accepted by acclaim, but as a blade inserted under the ribs of an organism already in motion. Dawn remained master of the palace and the final integrity of Terra's defense. His eye was upon continuity, cohesion, and the sanctity of the line. He sought to preserve shape under pressure, to ensure that every fortress, monitor group, and defense station held its ordained place as long as the Emperor's will could be made manifest in steel and blood. Perturabo cared nothing for shape, except where shape could be broken to greater effect. He fought for dislocation, for the misstep, for the false avenue that lured a fleet cluster beyond its supports, for the collapse of mutual coverage, for the exact moment when confidence became overextension, and overextension became death. The strategium beneath the palace became a furnace of light and command. Hololithic representations of Luna, the Martian approaches, the Jovian anchorages, the belt redoubts, the inner picket lines, and the defense orbits around Terra hung in layered brilliance, all of them alive with shifting vectors and casualty tallies. Data scribes worked until their fingers bled. Servo skulls drifted through the chamber, trailing incense and printed kill returns. Mechanicum adepts barked machine cant over shield harmonics and targeting solutions. Imperial Fists officers stood rigid with disciplined fury as Iron Warriors' siege savants coolly marked certain stations for abandonment before they had yet suffered meaningful damage. Varn had no station among the Primarchs, but Valen had brought him into the secondary command galleries as part of a labor disposition cadre, and from there he watched two different species of genius wage war with the same pieces and utterly different souls. Dawn would say, "Reinforce the line around the inner anchorages. No breach toward Terra can be permitted." Perturabo would answer, "Then stop trying to forbid the breach and decide where it should occur." Dawn would look at a cluster of defense monitors and see duty. Perturabo would look at them and see bait. It began at the outer, the station rings. The first belt of armed watch platforms and linked orbital batteries had already traded punishment with the advance elements of Horus's host. Some had been crippled, others still held. Requests for reinforcement multiplied by the minute. Men died sending them. Men died waiting for answers. Perturabo studied the battle lattice for less than a minute. "Withdraw Station Ring Ferrum from its present arc," he said. "Let the enemy believe we are losing control of the inner vector." A naval commander in dark void black saluted with rigid outrage. "Lord, Ferrum still holds. Its crews request munitions, not abandonment. They will receive neither." The man stared, as if his own ears had betrayed him. "The ring shields the approach to the western polar corridor." "No," said Perturabo. "It advertises it." His gauntleted finger moved across the projection. Immediately, a web of hidden variables lit around the vacated line. Mine drifts long held, silent beneath black hull shrouds. Mechanicum lance arrays cold and dormant within disguised ore platforms. Nova cannon solutions from defense monitors held far beyond immediate engagement range. Ambush vectors masked by the apparent disorder of retreating loyal assets. Dawn saw it at once. His mouth hardened. "You are opening the corridor deliberately." "I am opening the corridor the enemy already desires, because desire is a chain more reliable than discipline." The order went out. Station Ring Ferrum broke formation under fire, venting atmosphere and debris as it withdrew. Traitor augurs, or what passed for coherent augury amid the madness riding their fleets, read the shift as weakness. A spearhead of Sons of Horus cruisers, supported by fast escorts and a wedge of corrupted Mechanicum warships, surged into the gap with brutal confidence. They advanced in attack disposition, guns rolling, eager to widen the wound and rip the path toward Terra open. They entered the cage 3 minutes later. The first mine cloud blossomed, not as light, but as absence, a chain of void implosions that took the lead escort wave and folded their hulls inward like rotted fruit crushed in a fist. Before the wreckage had cleared, the hidden lance batteries woke and drew straight suns across the darkness. Cruisers split from prow to stern. Torpedo magazines touched off inside armored bellies and turned whole ships into incandescent coffins. Then the Nova cannon fired. Even through shielded strategium projectors, the detonation made Varn recoil. The shot crossed the void as a swollen godstroke and struck amid the densest concentration of traitor hulls, blooming into a sphere of white annihilation that swallowed escorts, gutted a grand cruiser, and tumbled burning wreckage into the wake of the ships behind it. The corridor became a charnel drift of vaporized metal, spinning compartments, corpses, severed gun decks, and signal screams. The naval commander who had objected said nothing. His face looked as though some inner organ had just burst. Perturabo did not even turn to measure the effect of his own choice. He was already shifting other markers, setting further traps, reallocating fuel, calculating what the traitors would learn and how quickly they would adapt. And adapt they did. Horus had not crossed half the galaxy in rebellion by trusting momentum alone. The War Master read the pattern of loyalist response with the speed of a predator discovering that prey had grown teeth. He ceased pressing broad lines where Perturabo's ambushed geometry could consume him in disciplined portions. Instead, he unleashed killers. Abaddon came first. The reports reached Terra in a red tide of ruptured signals and dying voices. Sons of Horus assault claws punching through the hides of loyal warships. Boarding torpedoes hammering into carrier flanks. Breach decks running black with smoke and blood as Justaeran elites carved through defenders in the old. Chthonian style, close and ugly, bolt shells punching men apart at arm's length before chain blades opened the survivors from groin to gorget. Where Perturabo made a lattice, Abaddon broke the joints with brute savagery and murderous instinct. He did not waste time on perfect maneuvers where slaughter in the corridors would suffice. Soon there were images from helmet feeds and deck picts. A voidsman with his jaw blown off trying to keep pressure doors sealed, while black-armored traitors hacked through with power axes. Naval armsmen kneeling in gunsmoke, firing until the bolts ran dry, and then meeting Astartes with boarding pikes that snapped like kindling. A captain of the Saturnine pickets dragged from his command throne and beaten to red ruin, while his bridge crew were nailed to the cogitator banks by combat knives. Then came the word-bearers. Where the sons of Horus broke bodies, the 17th Legion broke certainty. Auspec's returns soured into blasphemous nonsense. Station machine. Spirits screamed in Binharik and lit every threat rune at once. Gun crews clawed their own eyes out after seeing shapes in the targeters that could not exist in clean space. Vox channels filled with whispered litanies in languages older than old Earth, and men listening too long forgot their own names, their own allegiance, even the location of their limbs. On one defense monitor, a whole ratings deck was found, kneeling in rows before an access hatch painted from within with blood. The hatch opened into vacuum. No survivor could explain how the blood had been placed. Malkador named it warp corruption. The Mechanicum named it scrap code possession. The frightened masses named it the end. Perturabo named it interference and demanded redundant systems, blind fire routines, hardline relays, and the immediate euthanizing of any bridge crew that displayed contamination. That won him fresh hatred. The other defenders had already found the Iron Warriors hard to stomach on Terra. In the void, they came to despise them with a purity that almost eclipsed the traitors themselves. The sons of Perturabo did not linger for doomed heroics. They cut transit cables to isolate infected decks, even with loyal armsmen still trapped beyond the seals. They vented compartments occupied by boarding actions, if probability suggested retaking them would waste more strength than their contents were worth. They detached crippled escorts from tow lines and left them spinning if the drag endangered higher value hulls. They did not call it cruelty, they called it arithmetic. Cowards, one Imperial Army Commodore spat when an Iron Warriors lieutenant ordered his troop transport screen abandoned to preserve a munitions convoy. The lieutenant did not even glance at him. "No," he said, "accountants." Varn heard that exchange in the secondary relay pit and remembered it later with nausea. He had thought there could be nothing colder than the reclamation of the western districts. He had not yet understood what it meant for an entire legion to wage war without the narcotic of noble death. The ugliest of Perturabo's decisions came on the third day of continuous void battle over the inner approaches. A loyal fleet cluster, damaged and scattered from prior engagements, had fallen back in poor order along a narrow vector between a debris drift and the edge of a half-broken minefield. Their engines were laboring. Their ammunition was low. Tens of thousands of crew still lived aboard them, perhaps more. Behind them, angling hard through wreckage, came a traitor push group that had weathered 2 ambushes and was now threatening to punch through toward the Terra envelope at exactly the wrong angle, where the existing defense grid would take too long to reorient. The cluster could perhaps escape if reinforced. Dawn argued to support them. Perturabo studied the returns, calculated relative drift, line of pursuit, the delay imposed by rerouting support elements, the risk to the palace envelope if the traitor group broke free of containment. He asked for no counsel. "Signal cluster Hecaton," he said. "All vessels to scuttle by reactor overload and collision burn. Immediate execution." There was a silence in the chamber so complete that even the machine hum seemed to recoil. The admiral responsible for relaying the order went pale. "Lord, there are tens of thousands aboard." "Yes, they can still be withdrawn." "No, they are loyal servants of the throne." Perturabo's gaze settled on him with such dead weight that Varn felt it in his own spine, despite being half the chamber away. "Then let them serve." Dawn's voice struck like thunder. "There is time to recover them." "There is time," Perturabo said, "to deny the enemy the vector. There is not time for both." Dawn stepped close, the auramite of his armor burning in the strategium light. "You ask men to die without even the dignity of combat." Perturabo turned back to the hololith. "I ask them to die as masonry dies, holding long enough for the structure behind it to remain standing." The order was sent. Varn watched the returns through gritted teeth. One by one, the vessels of Cluster Hecaton flared bright with overload signatures. Some captains obeyed at once, ramming their own crippled ships into converging pursuit lines before the reactors went up and turned the whole killing lane into a blossom of plasma glare, tumbling armor, and hard radiation. One tried to break off and was shot to pieces by the traitors before he could clear the trap. Another held the line half a minute longer than ordered, perhaps out of pride, perhaps out of confusion, perhaps because somewhere aboard that ship a mortal commander wanted one last chance to matter by his own choice rather than another's. Then his reactor burst too, and the entire vector collapsed into a furnace of spinning wreckage that the traitor group could not pass without ruinous delay. Perturabo nodded once. "Reassign the surviving batteries. Close the gap." No prayer was spoken for the dead. It was after this that Sanguinius entered the war at close hand. Until then, the Angel had been a presence on relay channels, an uplift in shattered morale, a gleam reported from aerial reserve deployments and blood-soaked landing grounds, where his sons fought with a beauty so terrible it unsettled even hardened veterans. But now he came to the strategium in person, wings furled close in the confines of the chamber, his armor burnished though blackened at the greaves from war soot. There was blood on one cheek, not his own. He seemed to bring light with him, not softness, never softness, but a nobility so clean that it made the room's iron disciplines look diseased. He listened to the latest dispositions in silence. He studied the same death grids and kill tallies. He saw, as Dawn saw, what Perturabo was preserving, and by what methods. When he spoke, his voice was calm enough to shame lesser men. "You are buying survival with souls already spent." Perturabo did not bother to disguise his disdain. "Would you prefer to purchase defeat at a higher moral price?" Sanguinius met his gaze without flinching. "I would prefer that the Imperium remember it is defended by more than calculations." "The Imperium," Perturabo said, "will remember whatever survives to write." Something cold moved behind the Angel's beauty then. Not weakness wounded, but wrath held on a chain. There are men dying above terror who deserve better than to be measured as fuel. There are billions below terror, said Perturabo, who deserve not to be butchered because their defenders prized sentiment over function. For an instant, Varn thought the chamber might crack beneath the pressure between them. Instead, Sanguinius inclined his head, not in concession, but in acknowledgement of an enemy fact he could not deny. "I will hold where you cannot inspire," the angel said. Perturabo's lip curled by the smallest degree, "and I will preserve what your inspiration cannot." So the war continued under twin shadows, Dawn the wall, Sanguinius the flame, Perturabo the engine that fed both with flesh and iron. Yet for all the slaughter of the traps, for all the brilliance of the kill geometries, Horus still gained ground. He had numbers beyond honest reckoning. He had the initiative of the attacker and the corruption of the warp riding in his wake. He had madness in place of caution, where caution would only have let Perturabo carve him apart in measured bites. When a fleet element was lost, another drove past the wrecks. When a vector closed, 3 more were tested in blood. When ambush destroyed a spearhead, the corpses became cover for the next assault. The void itself seemed to sicken under the pressure of his advance. Auspec's ghosts multiplied. Time stamps slipped. Some ships reported enemy contacts before those contacts had physically entered the battle space. Others fired upon silhouettes that only became real minutes later, as though the galaxy itself were learning to convulse around the War Master's will. And then the landings began. At first they came as isolated burn trails punching through the atmosphere, a few assault packets, a few drop cohorts, wreckage and raiders and broken formations seeking any ground they could claim with violence. Then the pattern thickened. Soon the skies above Terra were no longer sky, but descent. Varn stood atop a western artillery bastion at shift turnover and saw the heavens become a cataract of fire. Dropcraft screamed downward in ranks. Assault rams burned like spears hurled by enraged gods. Orbital debris rained in molten sheets. Men fell in pieces from ruptured landers. Whole compartments hit the upper atmosphere spinning, burst open, and spilled bodies that struck the ground as red impact blossoms across the trench. Seas. Macro defense fire filled the air with explosions, layered upon explosions, until the cloud shell over Terra glowed a permanent infernal orange. Beyond the palace districts, continents disappeared beneath ash. The first traitor masses reached ground in the outer dead zones by the millions, then by magnitudes that mocked the word million. They landed in fire, in poison, in crater fields, in zones already pre-sighted for annihilation, and still they came. Auxilia gone to treachery, thrall packs, Titan support columns, Legion drop cohorts, engines whose hulls writhed with demonic heat, gunships with icons carved in skin. The earth shook with the impact of their arrival, until every trench wall shivered and old bones surfaced in the mud. Varn found Valen in the Bastion command vault, watching the landing grids update with relentless bad news. The void traps were not enough, Varn said before he could stop himself. Valen did not rebuke him. He only kept watching the projections. "Nothing is enough," he said. "That is the nature of this war. We do not seek enough. We seek later." That night, though Terra had no true night any longer, Perturabo stood alone upon an upper observation platform near the inner palace guns. The wind dragged ash across the stone like grave dust over a sarcophagus lid. The sky was red with re-entry fire and the black silhouettes of warships killing one another above the shield lines. Behind him, the palace bells still tolled. Ahead of him, the first ground offensives of the greater siege were already crawling into being across a world stripped of innocence and nearing the end of recognizable form. Varn had been sent there with casualty ledgers and fresh labor tallies. He waited at the prescribed distance, unnoticed, or at least unremarked. The Primarch spoke without turning. Perhaps to Varn, perhaps to the guns, perhaps to the dead, already gathering in numbers too vast for counting. This will not be won by walls, alone. Varn did not answer. He knew enough now to understand silence as the only safe devotion. Perturabo's gaze remained fixed on the burning heavens, Stone is simple, iron is simple, even void war is simple in the end. Weight, distance, time, expenditure. His voice lowered further. But men are a weaker material. They break in ways mathematics cannot wholly discipline. They cling to symbols. They draw strength from lies. They require belief, even while dying beneath the evidence. Far below, sirens wailed over the western deadfall corridors. Somewhere artillery began again, the sound so deep it seemed to rise from the planet's own marrow. The siege, Perturabo said, will be of minds now, of stamina, of what each side can be made to accept as necessary before it calls itself damned. At last he turned, and Varn saw that there was no uncertainty in him, only a bleak and absolute understanding. Terror will have to become unrecognizable, said the Yi, Lord of Iron, or it will not remain terror at all. By the time the ground war truly began, terror no longer resembled a world built for men. It had become frontage. Continents were measured not by mountain or sea, but by depth of trenching, by artillery reach, by reserve rail capacity, by the number of infantry waves their scarified planes could swallow before becoming too clogged with corpses for armor to advance. The old geographies had been erased beneath fortification and bombardment. Riverbeds were rerouted into anti-armor ditches. Hive sprawls had been hammered flat into kill fields or stripped to skeletal ferrocrete shells and repurposed as gun redoubts. The outer belts of the throne world had become war layered upon war, thousands of fronts nested within larger fronts, all of them bleeding into one another until command itself became an act of faith performed through static, smoke, and guesswork. Even the Titans looked diminished by it. Aghast Varn saw them through a fog of ash and drifting promethium soot as he stood atop a command bunker in the western defense depth, their god engines striding amid shell bursts with the inevitability of ancient judgments. Warlords traded sun-bright annihilation across valleys of trenches. Reavers ran like predatory cathedrals through burning refinery fields. Warhounds loped at the flanks of armored spearheads, their weapons hosing whole battalions into vapor or reducing bunker apertures to slagged wounds in the ground. Around their legs, beneath their notice, solar auxilia cohorts died in order, levy battalions died in heaps, and mechanicum maniples fought on even after their torsos had been opened and their oil mingled with their blood in the mud. The front extended beyond all sensible comprehension. Varn had access to the command channels and still could not grasp it as a whole. Reports arrived from trench seas, whose names he had never heard. Batteries ceased transmitting and were simply gone, entire armored. Formations vanished into storms of static and warp bloom and were later found as smoldering piles of slag with their crews fused inside. Legionaries fought in one sector, Titans in another, massed infantry and artillery in a third, while two lines to the north, a plague front rolled through listening posts and killed faster than bolter fire could. There was no single battle for terror. There were a million, all screaming at once, and at the center of too many of them stood two brothers who had never learned how to look upon one another without seeing insult. The daily councils between Rogel Dawn and Perturabo took place in a lower strategium chamber that had by now lost all pretense of dignity. The air smelled of hot metal, blood, and exhausted machine oil. Secondary projectors had been dragged in to handle the scale of the running fronts. Vox servitors hung from track mounts in rows like skinned cherubs of iron and parchment, their mouths working ceaselessly as they disgorged casualty tallies and transmission fragments. The floor was littered with shattered data slates, spent stim files, prayer strips trampled into grime, and the occasional dark stain from an officer whose heart or mind had failed at his post. Dawn stood over the central display in his armor of storm-lit gold, his face cut from the same severity as the walls he loved. Perturabo loomed opposite him in iron and hazard-marked brutality, broad as an execution device. Between them floated the western sectors, the Delphic Rise, the burial trenches of the northern belts, the line of sacrificial bastions now under direct pressure, and a dozen new breaches being forced by traitor armor, infantry, and engines too hideous for formal designation. Dawn placed a gauntleted finger against a bastion rune pulsing amber. Bastion Helios holds. Reinforce it. Perturabo did not look at him. No. It bars the most stable approach to the inner rail nexus. It bars it for another hour at best. After that, it becomes a coffin full of ammunition for the enemy. It buys time. Perturabo's eyes flicked toward him at last. Then let it die usefully instead of honorably. The chamber chilled further. Dawn said, "Every bastion we lose narrows the margin. And every bastion you cling to past its proper death wastes the blood needed to kill in depth." Dawn's jaw hardened. "You speak of men as if they were aggregates in a ledger." Perturabo answered at once. "That is because they are." For a moment, Varn thought one of them would finally loose the accumulated poison of decades in a blow that would flatten every mortal in the chamber. Instead, Dawn bent over the projection, eyes narrowing, and studied the wider pattern. He saw what Perturabo saw, though he despised the seeing. Bastion Helios was not being attacked for itself. The traitor pressure there was shaping the line, forcing reserves to commit, forcing artillery to reveal itself. If it were held too long, the breach zones around it would merge, and the defenders would be trapped in an admirable ruin. Dawn hated him for being correct. Varn had begun to understand that this hatred was among Terra's most useful resources. "Then mark its collapse," Dawn said. "But the withdrawal must be ordered and covered. No rout." Perturabo inclined his head the smallest fraction. It was the nearest thing they came to harmony. That was how they fought together. Not as brothers reconciled, nor even as commanders of similar soul. They fought as rival architects forced to raise the same cathedral while loathing the shape of each other's hands. Dawn sought integrity. Perturabo sought dislocation. Dawn wanted the line to stand cleanly for as long as human endurance and disciplined retreat allowed. Perturabo wanted each position to reach the exact second of maximum utility and then die in demolition, landslip, or overlapping fire, funneling the enemy where pre-sighted. Batteries could reap them in obedient rows. This difference spread through their legions like a secondary war. The loyal Iron Warriors began fighting the Imperial Fists in everything but name. Not with bolter and blade, though more than one corridor confrontation came near it, but with doctrine sharpened into accusation. Imperial Fists captains railed that Iron Warriors officers were gutting positions too early, collapsing galleries with defenders still inside, severing support trenches, rerouting munitions to kill fields, while bastions still screamed for shells. Iron Warriors centurions answered that the Fists were squandering lives to preserve symbols, plugging breaches with stubborn pride, when they should have been ceding ground by design and burying the attackers under enfilade grids prepared days in advance. In one reserve trench near the western deadfall corridors, Varn watched the argument turn almost physical. A Fists captain with half his helm torn away seized an Iron Warriors siege lieutenant by the gorget and snarled, "You abandoned the North Traverse while my men were still countercharging." The lieutenant's voice came flat through his vox grill. "Your men were already dead. They were holding. They were delaying collapse of a structure scheduled for demolition. That is not the same thing." The captain actually drew breath to strike him. Only the arrival of Keir Valen, his iron-grey plate painted with fresh arterial spray, ended the confrontation. Valen did not shout. He simply stared at both officers until the Imperial Fist let go. "This is not your private insult," Valen said. "It is terror. Contain yourselves." The captain spat blood into the mud. "Say that again when your calculations cost you Sons of Dawn." Valen's answer was colder than the wind over corpse pits. "They already have. If Angron had not come to the walls when he did, perhaps the friction would have remained a matter of ugly words, silent sabotage, and doctrinal loathing. But when the Red Angel descended, all such rivalries were drowned in the simpler language of dismemberment. The first true nightmare breach occurred at dusk, though the word meant little under the bruise-colored sky and the permanent firelight of bombardment. A series of traitor spearheads slammed into the outer defense belt around the shattered Manufactoria basin, supported by armor columns, berserker cohorts, and a bombardment so savage that whole trench sections simply ceased to exist as architecture. The warning runes over the local command vox turned red in waves. Then the World Eaters hit. There was no elegance to their assault, no patience, no siege orthodoxy. They came through the smoke and rupture gaps like an opened artery given legs, chain axes shrieking, helms spattered, armor lacquered black-red with old and new gore. Where disciplined traitor forces might have paused to consolidate a breach, the World Eaters widened it. With their own bodies, trampling their dead beneath their boots, throwing themselves into gunfire just to reach killing range faster. Their howls over the vox were not language so much as sacrament performed with broken teeth. At their center came Angron. Varn did not see the Primarch descend, only the effect of his presence. Whole sectors of the wall line stopped reporting in any coherent form. Astartes' panic, rare and awful, began to bleed through channels usually reserved for measured target calls and reserve requests. One Imperial Army colonel shrieked that the line had become meat. Another begged for orbital fire on his own position and was cut off by a sound like someone being fed through mill gears. Then picked feeds from a bunker crown flickered live for 6 seconds. Angron crashed through a gun casemate wall in a hail of masonry and blood, immense, red-armored, impossible to mistake for anything but concentrated hatred granted flesh. He moved with a speed that mocked his size. A heavy weapons team vanished under his axes in a single wet detonation. An Imperial Fist sergeant met him with power sword raised and was torn into halves so violently that one of the pieces hit the bunker ceiling and stuck there. Around him, the World Eaters flooded through the breach in chain-blade fog, chopping men apart faster than they could fall, hacking limbs free, punching roaring bolt shells into faces already half-severed by axe teeth. The feed ended when the picked unit was struck by someone's spine. By the time reserve reports stabilized, a whole belt of outer defenses had ceased to be a defense and become instead a butcher's pit, wide as a district. Trenches were clogged with bodies torn open from crotch to collar. Gun shields had toppled into mounds of organs and brass. In one redoubt, priests were found still blessing ammunition over piles of amputated limbs because the wounded were arriving faster than medici orderlies could sort the salvageable from the dying. The blessings did not stop when the blood reached their ankles. Perturabo studied the collapse pattern and did not waste a word on outrage. "Trigger pyre protocol in sectors Vesper through Cinder," he ordered. A hush passed through the chamber, because those sectors were behind the active front, not on it. They were stacked with reserve materiel, wounded evacuation stations, abandoned hab shells, and tens of thousands of personnel not yet withdrawn. Dawn turned. "You cannot." Perturabo's voice came like iron sliding against stone. "Angron is not taking cover in our depth. There are still wounded in those districts. There are wounded everywhere. Refugees. Obstructions." Dawn stepped forward. "Enough." But the projection already showed what Perturabo had seen. The breach was not localized. The World Eaters had opened the belt like a throat and were driving inward with other traitor cohorts exploiting the terror. If the sectors behind remained intact, they would become shelter, staging ground, ammunition capture points, and pressure corridors all at once. Malcador said nothing. Valdor said nothing. The silence of those two men was its own kind of verdict. Perturabo looked at Dawn. Decide, stone or victory, mercy or the throne. Dawn's face became unreadable in the way mountains are unreadable before avalanche. For one heartbeat, 2, 3. Varn believed he would forbid it and damn the calculation. Then he closed his eyes once, opened them, and said, Signal the withdrawal. Give them all the time we can. Perturabo did not nod. He simply gave the execution order. Varn was close enough to the western sectors to witness the atrocity from the edge of its preparation. Sirens bawled. Trains overloaded with wounded lurched along fortress rails, while medici orderlies dragged stretchers through shell bursts and falling ash. Men with their faces wrapped in blood-soaked bandages pounded on blast doors, already cycling shut. Munitions crawlers overturned in the crush. One labor overseer tried to turn his work gang around and was nailed through both hands to a loading crane by combat engineers who could not spare the delay of his panic. He screamed there for an hour while the crane continued lifting shell pallets over his head. The pyre charges fired before the evacuation was complete. The first detonations punched whole HAB clusters upward in sheets of ferrocrete, masonry, body parts, and burning promethium. Then came the chemical ignitions. Stored toxins aerosolized into rolling curtains of green-black smoke that crawled low along the streets before boiling upward through shattered windows and transit mouths. Fires took wounded shelters and reserve depots together. Ammunition cooked off in sympathy with reactor cells, fuel stores, and demolition caches until the entire district convulsed in one sustained, hideous exhalation. Through the smoke, Varn saw silhouettes hammer at sealed, vault doors from the inside. He saw a medici train vanish beneath a collapsing overpass and reappear only as flaming wreckage spurting men in pieces. He saw the wind pick up ashes that were not all ash and drag them across the trenches in a greasy veil. The corpse smoke rolled toward the breach and swallowed the first waves of pursuing traitors. For a brief span of time, even Angren's berserk momentum lost coherence inside that reeking chemical fog. Vox returns from enemy channels turned to choking roars and misaligned position calls. Entire advancing elements stumbled into mine belts they would otherwise have avoided. Pre-sighted artillery grids awakened and began scything through the obscured mass. That was when Sigismund struck. Perturabo had identified the fracture before anyone else. The World Eaters had bitten too deep, too fast, and in the poison smoke their support had thinned. Their fury had become a spear without a shaft. He marked the weakness on the hololith and sent the order with all the emotional warmth of a bolt shell being chambered. Commit Sigismund, not to hold, to sever. The chosen imperial fists did not argue. They never argued when sent toward murder. Sigismund led the counter-assault with a picked blade of veterans and reserve Astartes, entering the corpse smoke where mortal infantry could no longer function. Varn saw only fragments from relay picts and trench-line witness accounts, but even fragments were enough. Yellow armor emerging from the fog like execution icons. Bolters hammering at point-blank range until the smoke itself flashed. Chain blades and power swords rising and falling with machine regularity. Sigismund at the center, black sword in hand, moving without waste, cutting down World Eaters in halves, thirds, sprays, hard, efficient murders that looked almost merciful compared with the frenzied disassembly all around him. Where he struck, the breach stopped being a flood and became a clot. Berserkers crashed against disciplined counterattack wedges and were thrown back just long enough for the guns to speak again. Whole avenues vanished under descending artillery. The smoke became red mud. The red mud became a slurry of flesh, shell casings, shattered masonry, and armor fragments. Still, the defenders were breaking. By the fourth day of the main ground assault, trench discipline had become a thing enforced as often by terror as by faith. Priests moved through the lines blessing guns over piles of amputated limbs because there was no clean place left from which to preach. Engineers crucified deserters to loading frames, nailed sappers to signal masts, and hung mutineers from munition cranes to remind the living that fear of the enemy was not the only fear available to them. Corpses were packed into trench walls under boards and wire because proper revetment materials were running short. Men slept with the dead against their shoulders and woke to find rats or scavenger servitors already at work on the faces of their comrades. Even so, Terra was learning. Horus understood that soon enough. Reports flowed to him from his captains and spies. The throne world was not simply enduring the hammering. It was adapting to his weight, measuring his reflexes, punishing his preferences. Every violent success risked becoming a lure. Every breach might be the true breach, or the grave selected for his momentum. So he escalated. Warp saturation intensified across the fronts. Storm fronts with no meteorological cause rolled over trench belts and rained blood or ash or blind worms that burrowed into open wounds. Death Guard contamination clouds drifted behind bombardments and turned casualty stations into plague pits within hours. Terror shells fell upon rear districts, not to kill efficiently, but to spread skinless ruin, vox shrieks, and impossible apparitions among the labor populations. Word-bearers raised icons of flayed flesh inside no man's land, and the weak-minded among the defenders began hearing sermons in the shelling. Prisoners were returned across the lines in pieces arranged as devotional texts. The war had ceased to be a contest of fortifications alone. It had become an assault upon what men could witness and still remain men. The worst assault of that stage of the siege came under a sky the color of old bruises. Traitor artillery had spent hours flattening the outer works in one chosen theater, while assault masses assembled behind the smoke, screened by plague fog and electromagnetic corruption. When they came with everything. Legionaries in black, green, blue, and blood red. Armor columns vomiting black exhaust. Mutant thralls in tides. Engines with mouths in their hulls. Titans pacing behind them. A wall of force so broad that no single gun line could claim to see either end of it. Perturabo watched it form and did not call for a glorious stand. He called for a shaped death. Bastions were ordered to hold to the second and no longer. Reserve trenches were stripped and quietly emptied. Ammunition stores left in place were seeded with hidden charges. Fortress rails carried men forward in silence and carried others backward in equal silence. Dawn objected to portions of the plan, then saw the wider lattice, and his objection curdled into the same bitter obedience that had become the price of survival. When the assault hit, the outer works held just long enough to convince the traitors they were winning honestly. Then the line died on schedule. Whole bastions collapsed inward as their own foundations were annihilated. Secondary walls behind them opened with pre-arranged withdrawal gaps that looked like panic and funneled the attackers into valleys of fire. Artillery hidden for days unmasked in disciplined tiers and began reaping the packed traitor masses from the flanks. Mine belts detonated under armored columns already committed too deep to reverse. Subterranean galleries were collapsed beneath marching infantry and swallowed companies at a time. Titans advanced into soil laced with magma charges and vanished in eruptions of ash, molten rock, and armor plate. For hours, the traitor host was massacred. For hours, the defenders died to make the massacre possible. 1 million loyal soldiers held collapsing sectors too long because timing mattered more than survival. Evacuation orders were delayed by design to keep the enemy density high. Guns kept firing over retreating lines until those lines ceased to be lines and became shredded remnants crawling through smoke and red slurry. Entire reserve echelons were fed into the maw to preserve the geometry of annihilation for another minute, another 2, another 10. By the time the assault finally broke, the ground before the outer palace works was a continent of butchered ruin. Burning tanks lay half-sunk in body drifts. Titans smoldered like toppled shrines. The air itself had texture from atomized flesh and pulverized stone. The traitor. Advance in that theater had been annihilated so completely that even the surviving enemy withdrew in staggered disbelief. The victory report was delivered to the strategium just before shift change. The enemy assault in the chosen sector had been destroyed. Their dead numbered beyond accurate count. Their breach had failed. The outer works in that theatre no longer meaningfully existed. Loyal casualties had passed into the millions. Vast sections of Terra's own defences were gone, blasted apart by the defenders as readily as by the enemy. No one cheered. Dawn stood over the smoking hololith and looked as though the report had flensed something from inside him. Perturabo studied the same figures, with the face of a man confirming a predicted collapse load in a bridge he had knowingly broken to save the city beyond. Varn waited in the rear of the chamber with fresh labor returns, ash on his boots, dried blood under his nails, and the stink of corpse smoke still living in his clothes. He heard one exhausted naval attaché whisper, as if terrified the walls themselves might take offense. If this is victory, what in the Emperor's name would defeat resemble? No one answered him. There was no answer left in words, only in the guns still firing beyond the palace walls, and in the truth that every man in that room now understood. Terra had held. Terra was becoming something that deserved to burn for having survived. There came a stage in the defense of Terra when the Imperial Palace ceased to be a fortress and became instead a mouth. It did not happen in a single order, nor in some ceremonial declaration before banners and oathfire. It happened by attrition, by hammerblow, by the gradual surrender of every lingering pretense that walls existed to preserve what lay behind them. Under Perturabo's hand, the throne world's heart was remade according to a harsher principle. The palace was no longer to endure the siege. It was to digest it. Accursed. Varn saw the transformation first from below. He was sent beneath the western and northern approaches on repeated inspections, carrying labor tallies, demolition confirmations, casualty abstracts, and revised tunnel maps between command vaults that had once been maintenance galleries and were now the arteries of a war machine too vast for any single mortal understanding. The buried levels of the palace multiplied in function the deeper one went. Old transit rails had been widened and plated into fortress lines, carrying endless loads through the dark. Macro shells stacked in rune-marked cradles, pallets of lacelles, chain drums, caskets of rad munitions, coffins of gene-coded reserve weapons, replacement troops drugged into a waking stupor, and body trains so overloaded with the dead that limbs trailed from the carts and left red smears along the steel. New guns had been buried beneath old plazas. Retraction engines the size of Manufactoria groaned behind armored shutters, ready to heave whole bulwarks up from the ground where the enemy would least expect them. Demolition galleries were cut beneath avenues already cratered from previous bombardments, their charges nested so deep in the foundations that an entire district could be made to fold in on itself with a signal rune and a spoken litany. Tunnel redoubts had been constructed in successive rings, one behind another, each designed not to hold indefinitely, but to break, withdraw, close, and kill. Magma vents from geothermic sources far below the palace bedrock had been tapped and harnessed by the Mechanicum into pressure chambers that could flood selected kill zones with incandescent death. Rad zones were marked in coded script upon vault maps, sectors deliberately salted with invisible poison so that any force taking them would inherit a slower execution. False retreat lines had been furnished, stocked, blessed, and then secretly wired for obliteration. Every road toward the palace had a second use. Every trench had a concealed purpose. Every reserve chamber was also a grave waiting for its appointed hour. The subterranean rails never ceased. Their noise became the underground heartbeat of terror, steel grinding on steel, track motors shrieking, orders barked through vox horns, the hammer clang of shell cranes, the wet slap of flesh from transport slabs, the muttered prayers of logisticians who had stopped believing in mercy but not yet in meaning. Down there the war was measured by tonnage, clearance speed, and how long a mutilated body still counted as a living man for the purpose of ration accounting. Varn passed through it all with his rebreather filters blackening by the hour, and thought more than once that the underworks resembled the innards of some great predatory beast. Ammunition went in, men went in, smoke and blood came out, the palace devoured and transformed. Keir Valen understood that better than most, and the knowledge had begun to sour him. The Iron Warriors. Centurion, once a creature of clipped commands and unflinching certainty, had acquired a harder stillness in recent weeks, as if some internal patience were calcifying into resentment. He moved through the buried works like a functionary of doom, inspecting vaults, correcting gun angles, ordering secondary supports cut, dismissing pleas for delay with the cold authority of one who no longer expected to be thanked by any living soul. Yet Varn had learned to recognize the tiny signs of strain in him, the extra second before issuing a termination order, the way his hand lingered near broken masonry where old imperial eagles had been deliberately chiseled off to widen a firing slit, the contempt with which he now received messages from palace commands staffed by men who despised Iron Warrior methods even while living because of them. In a loading vault beneath the northern killbands, while trains screamed past carrying reserve troops towards some fresh slaughter above, Varn asked him, the question he had spent days fearing. "Do you regret it, Lord?" Valen stood over a tactical slab showing ammunition depletion across 3 concentric palace rings. He did not look up. "Regret is an indulgence. That is not what I asked." The Centurion's helm was mag-locked to his belt. His scarred face, lit by hololithic target runes, looked more eroded than human. "We are saving Terra in a way Terra will never forgive," he said at last. "The Praetorian sons hate us because we kill their ideals before the enemy can kill their bodies. The army hates us because we count them honestly. The Mechanicum hates us because we force them to waste wonders on necessity instead of permanence. When this war is remembered, if it is remembered, men will praise the walls. They will praise the gold. They will praise noble sacrifice and last stands and banners blackened by shellfire." His mouth hardened. "They will not praise the hand that mined the avenue where their brothers died. They will not bless the legion that poisoned its own cisterns, collapsed its own districts, and taught the palace how to eat." "You still do it," Varn said. Valen gave him a glance colder than a voidlock. "Because I was not bred to seek love. I was bred to win sieges." Above them, another train thundered by with such force that dust and old bone grit shook from the vault ceiling. The strategic revelation came not in secret, but in outrage. Perturabo had by then assumed practical mastery over much of the layered interior defense, and even Rogel Dawn had begun to realize there were aspects of the Lord of Iron's design he had not yet been shown. That concealment alone was enough to wound the Praetorian's pride. The content beneath it nearly broke the brittle cooperation that had thus far kept Terra from dissolution. The council convened in a high vault chamber just within the palace's deeper military precincts. The bombardment overhead was constant now, a dull, gigantic pulse through the stone. Present were Dawn and Perturabo, Malcador, Valdor, Sanguinius, Jagatai Khan newly returned from one of his bleeding raids beyond the primary lines, and selected senior captains from the Imperial Fists, Blood Angels, White Scars, and Iron Warriors. Varn was not meant to hear what followed, but he was part of the labor and mapping cadre, updating under-gallery projections, and proximity in war is often the difference between ignorance and terrible education.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
Perturabo activated the hololiths without preamble. The palace approaches rose in light above the chamber floor, not as they stood now, but as they would stand in successive states of loss. One wall line dimmed and vanished. An inner bulwark retracted. A bastion ceased to exist. A district behind the front was shown being deliberately yielded. Then another. Then a whole sector. As each apparent concession occurred, hidden lines flared around it, layered arcs of enfilade fire, artillery depth, cross-tunnel assault routes, buried guns, rad pockets, sealable corridors, aerial kill boxes, and demolition geometries so complex they resembled the bones of a mechanical god. Dawn stared at the projection in absolute silence. Sanguinius spoke first. "These sectors are not contingencies." "No," said Perturabo. "They are invitations." Jagatai Khan gave a short, humorless breath that was not quite a laugh. "You mean to let them in?" "I mean," said Perturabo, "to decide where inside they will die." Dawn turned then, and Varn had seen men under orbital fire look less strained. "You planned for the surrender of entire approaches. I planned for their expenditure. You kept this from me." Perturabo's expression did not shift. "Because you would have argued before you understood." "I understand," Dawn said. The words ground from somewhere deep and hard. "You propose to yield sanctified ground within the defense. Depth of the palace itself. You mean to seal enemy armies inside concentric rings like vermin in a furnace wall." "Now," said Perturabo, "you understand." The chamber erupted. An Imperial Fists captain called it blasphemy against the palace. A Blood Angels officer asked how many loyal troops were expected to remain in the surrendered sectors when the rings closed. A White Scar's Noyan Khan smiled in open disbelief and asked whether the Lord of Iron intended to besiege his own siege. Malkador said nothing, which was worse than condemnation. Valdor watched Perturabo with the expression of a man measuring whether necessity and abomination had finally become indistinguishable. Sanguinius stepped closer to the projection. Light from the burning fronts danced over the blood drop icons on his armor. "The cost will be unspeakable." Perturabo's answer came at once. "The alternative is extinction spoken aloud." Dawn jabbed a finger at the surrendered sectors. "There are arsenals there. Shrine vaults, evacuation arteries, fallback barracks. There are traps there. Terran soil, material." The word cracked in the chamber like a shot. For the first time, Jagatai's amusement died entirely. "You are not wrong," the Khan said, "but there is poison in how readily you say such things." Perturabo looked at him without warmth. "Poison that preserves life is called medicine by those clever enough to survive it." Dawn moved as if to strike him. Sanguinius barred the motion with one wing and one uplifted hand, not forceful, but enough. The angel's face was terrible then, not with fury alone, but with the full weight of understanding. He saw that Perturabo's design could save Terra. He also saw what kind of victory it would require. Above them, faint but unmistakable, the great palace bells began to toll again. No message came from the Emperor. That silence poisoned everything. If the Master of Mankind had spoken, had forbidden, sanctioned, rebuked, or blessed, then perhaps the Primarchs might have arranged their consciences around the utterance. But he remained upon the throne, distant even in his nearness, and so the burden of interpreting necessity fell to sons who were already breaking under the effort of being themselves. Some saw Perturabo's plan and called it genius sharpened by truth. Others saw the same lattice and named it damnation with efficient handwriting. Dawn hated it. Sanguinius dreaded it. Jagatai mistrusted any wall that swallowed its own sons, yet admitted the beauty of the kill pattern. Valdor accepted it only because the alternative was a future in which there was no palace left to judge. Malkador still said little, his face growing gaunter by the day, as if every permitted atrocity shaved years from a soul already burning itself hollow in service. While the loyalists argued over the morality of mechanical cruelty, Mortarion answered it with biological obscenity. The recovered trenches in the northern and western ruins began to sicken in ways artillery could not solve. It started with the ordinary signs of battlefield corruption: water fouled beyond boiling, cadavers swelling too fast, trench rot in men, who had not removed their boots in weeks. Then it worsened. Fog rolled over no man's land, carrying spores that bit through rebreather seals and nested in the lungs. Wounds sealed clean by medici cautery reopened after a day, and vomited black pus filled with moving white threads. Men drank from cisterns tested pure at dawn, and were coughing clots and strips of their own inner tissue by dusk. Reserve dugouts became plague cauldrons. The dead did not merely stink, they liquefied into fever pits that spread corruption through trench floors and sandbag revetments alike. In one line sector Varn visited, after an emergency logistics summons, the disease had killed faster than the shelling. He found men dead at the firing steps with lasrifles still in their hands, their skin grey-green and stretched tight over faces half-eaten by their own weeping sores. He found a whole medici bay abandoned except for the sounds from under the sheets, because the orderlies had run when they realized the patients were still alive under what they had mistaken for decomposition. Priests moved through the line with censers and promethium flasks, blessing one body and burning the next, without pausing to decide which sacrament better applied. Then Fulgrim came, and where Mortarians spread entropy, the Phoenicians spread desecration. His legion did not always attack to take ground. Often they attacked to make holding it unbearable. The Emperor's children struck sectors already frayed by plague and exhaustion, arriving in shrieking assault waves painted in impossible colors beneath grime and blood, their war gear screaming with sonic malice. Walls burst inward from resonant bombardments that liquefied organs before armor cracked. Vox. Channels filled with laughter, moaning, and ecstatic howls pitched just wrong enough to turn discipline into nausea. Some positions they took only for an hour, long enough to butcher the occupants with theatrical excess, string the remains through gun emplacements, lacquer shrine walls with flayed skin, and leave behind obscenities so intimate and revolting that even hardened soldiers balked at reoccupying the ground. The panic this caused ran deeper than casualty. Men could endure shelling, men could endure hunger, even plague, if wrapped in enough ritual and hatred, could be endured. But desecration entered by another road. It unstitched the mind. It told the weary and the wounded that there would be no clean martyrdom, no solemn burial, no noble death at all, only violation and mockery and the reduction of all human dignity to amusement for monsters wearing the faces of demigods. Against all this, the white scars and blood angels moved like punishment and reprieve together. Jagatai's sons were never still. They raided landing zones, cut supply tails, hunted artillery spotters, burned fuel dumps, and vanished before heavier traitor responses could pin them. They lived in motion through the choked approaches, appearing where enemy confidence had thickened into complacency. Varn heard tales from returning trench survivors of white-armored riders carving through thrall columns under the ash rain, of attack craft streaking low over plague belts to rake transport echelons into blazing ruin, of whole traitor convoys found hours later as smoking lines of butchered metal and headless corpses. The raids never stopped the assault. They spoiled it. They infected it with uncertainty. The Blood Angels did something different. They came from above like wrath still capable of beauty. When traitor spearheads pushed too hard, or Mortarians' poisoned fronts began thickening into stable gains, crimson gunships and jump-borne assault cadres descended through shell, smoke and flak with impossible precision. Varn watched one such strike from the upper galleries of a buried gun bastion. The sky split open with contrails and engine shrieks. Then, red-armored angels fell through the filth in disciplined meteors, their descent engines painting the smoke gold. They hit a traitor concentration, massed around a breached bulwark, and turned its center into surgical slaughter. Sanguinius himself was seen over the line that day, a winged red blur amid detonations, and men who had forgotten sleep and hope alike still found the strength to rise screaming and charge after the sight of him. It was never enough. Every hour still had to be bought in flesh. The resentment among the Iron Warriors deepened as that price mounted. Valen voiced it one cycle deep in a shell-sorting cavern where the vaulted roof shook with distant bombardment and dust drifted constantly over the stacked munitions. "They curse us for the shape of the blade," he said, reviewing the latest casualty reclamation order. "Yet they grip the hilt until their hands bleed. Let them curse. It changes nothing." One of his sergeants, helm under his arm and face striped with old scar tissue, answered with unusual bitterness. "When this is over, Lord, if it is over, they will say Dawn held. They will say Sanguinius inspired. They will say the Khan hunted. They will speak no word of the legion that taught the palace to close its teeth." Valen stared at the casualty slate until the device cracked in his gauntlet. "I know." It was Perturabo who finally named the full truth of what he was making. The revelation came in the central war chamber during a shift of maps from defense depth to isolation grids. The traitor landings had grown so extensive that many commanders still thought in terms of stopping the tide. Perturabo had moved beyond that. He called up a projection of the palace approaches and all the occupied sectors beyond them. Supply flows flickered. Ammunition consumption, fuel exhaustion, plague contamination, morale degradation estimates, tunnel collapses, rail interruption prospects, aerial interdiction routes, White Scars raid patterns, Blood Angels strike capacities, dormant demolition belts, hidden guns, reserve food stocks in sealed inner vaults. Then he drew the rings, not rings of defense, rings of encirclement. He was not merely holding the palace, he was building a counter-siege inside the siege itself, a design by which Horus's landed armies would be invited inward by degrees, severed from one another by planned withdrawals and targeted demolitions, denied mutual supply, trapped between false gains and concentric kill bands, then starved, shelled, poisoned, and butchered by sector until their very numbers became a liability too great to feed. The enemy host would think itself the besieger right up until the ground closed and the arithmetic reversed. Jagatai was the first to understand enough to smile, grim and wolf-thin. You would make their victory lines into prison walls. Perturabo looked at the projection as if it were self-evident. I would make Terra the larger fortress, and them the garrison dying inside it. Dorn said nothing for several moments. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and bleak. You are building a labyrinth of mass graves. Perturabo turned to him. I am building time. Time kills besiegers more faithfully than bolters. The first test of the design came sooner than any of them desired. In the southern Manufactoria approaches, a traitor spearhead composed of Sons of Horus line breakers, Death Guard support elements, corrupted armor, and thrall waves forced a deep breach through a sector that had seemed, by all ordinary reading, too weakened to retain. The outer bulwark collapsed. Secondary trenches were overrun. Palace vox channels filled with the usual roar of emergency, accusation, and prayer. Even hardened officers believed the line there had truly failed. The traitors believed it as well. They surged forward exultant, banners lifting through the smoke, armored columns grinding over their own dead to exploit the depth. Behind them came heavy infantry and supply crawlers eager to stabilize the gain. Forward commanders sent triumphal bursts to the War Master's fleet. They had broken deep. They had taken a throat road toward the inner precincts. The palace, they believed, was finally opening. Varn was in a buried command vault beneath that very theater when Perturabo gave the order. Seal the rings. The ground answered first. Charges laid days before in forgotten utility strata, and transit foundations ignited in sequence beneath the spearhead's rear. Entire streets and trench corridors dropped away into fire and collapse, cutting the leading traitor mass off from the support columns behind it. Then armored bulwarks rose from hidden housings along the flanks, slab after slab of ceramite and adamantium heaving, into place where rubble and ruin had masqueraded as irrecoverable wreckage. Tunnel mouths blew outward and disgorged reserve infantry, iron warriors, imperial fists, and mechanicum kill cohorts into the newly narrowed lanes. Buried guns erupted from false plazas and shattered hab courts, firing upward into vehicle underbellies and along packed infantry files. Fortress rails in the sub-levels screamed alive, delivering ammunition, replacement troops, and fresh gun crews, even as body trains began moving the other way. Above, the sky closed too. Blood Angel's strike wings came in low and murderous over the encircled ground, while White Scar's outriders cut at every remaining line of relief. Artillery, masked until the last possible second, awakened in full tears from 3 concentric depths. Their shells descended not as bombardment, but as sentence. The traitor spearheads, who moments before had believed themselves conquerors, discovered instead that the ground beneath them, the walls around them, and the sky above them had all been chosen in advance for their destruction. The first panic calls from inside the trap were almost pitiable in their confusion. Requests for map confirmation, demands for supporting armor that could no longer reach them, reports of sealed routes, impassable collapse belts, unknown gun positions, enfilade from impossible angles. Then panic gave way to rage as commanders realized they had not broken a defense at all. They had been swallowed by one. Varn stood at the vault's main hololith with the others and watched red runes blossom across the encircled sector, each one a formation, each one a population of living men, becoming raw arithmetic under Perturabo's hand. For a long moment, no one in the chamber spoke. Then Keir Valen, staring at the kill rings as they tightened and brightened, said in a voice so low it was nearly a prayer, "Now they understand where they landed." No one contradicted him. Above them the palace fired, and fired, and fired, like a mouth chewing. By then, the siege had learned to feed upon itself. The first great trap had not broken the traitor host. Nothing so merciful had occurred. It had taught them instead that Terra's defenders were no longer merely enduring pressure. They were shaping it, redirecting it, hardening it into a counterstroke vast enough to swallow whole armies. And so, the war changed again. The fronts did not simply advance or retreat. They constricted, they sealed. They became compartments of butchery, where millions of men who had crossed half a galaxy to storm the throne now found themselves storming for water, for munitions, for roads that no longer existed, for skies that had become hostile architecture and ground that remembered every footstep with murder. The loyalists began besieging the besiegers. Acast Varn watched the first full expression of it from a command bastion built into the shoulder of a broken macro battery line. From that height, the land seemed diseased. Fire curtains crawled in deliberate walls across the horizon, not random blazes of battle, but prearranged infernos, burning belts ignited by buried promethium lines and phosphex reservoirs to seal traitor footholds behind living barriers of chemical flame. Beyond and within those curtains, artillery stitched death in crossing tiers. Shells landed from 3 sides at once upon trapped invaders who had believed themselves victors only hours earlier. What had once been avenues of advance were now corridors of execution. What had once been captured ground was now enclosure. There was no clean sound in it, no battlefield music fit for monument or hymn. There was only the steady cough and hammer of massed batteries, the shriek of wounded metal, the thunder of collapsed charges biting through district foundations, and beneath it all, the animal noise of uncountable living things discovering too late that they had been caged in a kill geometry designed by minds that neither pitied nor relented. The trapped traitor forces fought like mad beasts. Some formed armored knots around wrecked transports and ammunition crawlers, trying to hold islands of coherence inside the storm. Others hurled themselves at the fire curtains in a frenzy of numbers, burning alive in heaps to bridge the flames with their own bodies. World Eaters roared through shell bursts and plague fog alike, hacking down their own slower allies when the press became too thick. Sons of Horus line captains tried to impose discipline over Vox channels, shrieking with static and panic. Word-bearers raised icons and called for deliverance from beyond the veil. Death Guard trudged forward, even while artillery stripped flesh from bone. None of it altered the fact that terror had closed a fist around them. What made it worse, what made the whole stage of war truly infernal, was that the fist was not a single hand. For a brief and terrible span, Rogel Dawn and Perturabo achieved something that history would have been right to fear and wrong to forget. They became complementary. Dawn held shape. Perturabo administered slaughter. One preserved the architecture of endurance, ensuring that each ring, each reserve belt, each tertiary wall line and ammunition artery remained coherent enough to function under impossible stress. The other turned that coherence into a weapon so pitiless that whole sectors seemed less defended than processed. Dawn judged what must remain standing. Perturabo judged what must be made to die. Between them, the palace ceased to be a passive object under attack and became a gigantic active engine of attritional murder. Varn saw them together in the lower strategium as fresh rings of encirclement were drawn around traitor lodgements in the northern and southern approaches. Dawn stood in gold and iron dust, face gaunt from sleepless command. One gauntlet braced on the hololithic table as casualty streams flared around him like battlefield ghosts. Perturabo loomed. Opposite, his broad, armored bulk haloed by target vectors and demolition overlays. There was no warmth between them, no reconciliation, no easing of the old poison. Yet their voices struck against one another with the precision of linked machinery. "This ring must not fail before the inner rail nexus is cleared," Dawn said. "It will not," Perturabo answered, "because I am not asking it to hold. I am asking it to close. The West Reserve bastions are overcommitted. Then reduce their frontage and flood the surplus routes. There are still wounded below the transit vaults. There are always wounded." Dawn's eyes hardened at that, but the next words came not in outrage, but in the grim idiom of agreement forced by necessity. "Then mark the flood line so our own reserves are not scalded with the enemy." Perturabo's reply was immediate. "Done." They were magnificent together. They were monstrous together. The counter-siege tightened across Terra's scarified face. White scars, deep strikes severed on world traitor supply lines faster than they could be repaired. The sons of Jagatai rode beyond accepted defensive logic, driving through gaps, over ruin belts, through ash storms and plague mists to hit ammunition fields, landing zones, fuel towers, and supply crawlers long after those sites should by all rights have been secure. Varn read the reports in exhausted stacks as they reached command relay. Entire munitions parks found blazing, their shell stocks cooking off in chains that turned night to false dawn. Landing aprons cut to scrap by hit and run armor raids. Vox arrays reduced to smoldering torsos of metal and bone. Thrall columns butchered along 50-mile stretches of transit route, their supply burdens left to bloat in the poison air. Titan counter-thrusts followed where the severing was done. Loyal god engines, some crippled, some smoke-blackened and staggering, were committed not to dramatic duels but to methodical crushing work. They advanced into sectors already isolated by Perturabo's artillery grids and tunnel collapses, their feet grinding over trapped infantry, their weapons hammering traitor armored concentrations that had lost resupply, repair, or retreat. Varn watched one such push from the upper slit galleries of a command casemate. A warlord of the Legio Ignatum strode through a curtain of black smoke, with one shoulder plate hanging loose and an arm weapon fused into a lump of molten ruin, yet still it advanced, firing with its remaining batteries into a traitor pocket trapped between two collapse belts. Men vanished under those discharges in smears of red vapor and spinning bone. Tanks became white skeletons of light before falling apart. The ruined earth boiled around the Titan's tread in mud made from flesh, oil, and powdered ferrocrete. The traitor landing zones withered under that treatment. Not all at once. Not enough to undo the invasion by miracle. But steadily, with the remorseless pressure of a noose drawn tighter, notch by notch. Ammunition became harder to move, fuel harder to refine, reinforcement routes harder to trust. What Horus had meant to be a war of vast, decisive momentum began turning into what Perturabo understood best, a war of expenditure, dislocation, and incremental suffocation. When the reports of this reached the vengeful spirit in proper aggregate, the War Master's fury was said to have frozen whole command decks into silence. He had expected terror to become a siege he could break with weight and terror, a final masterpiece of attritional violence in which the Lord of Iron would once have been his greatest instrument. Instead, that same genius stood below, weaponizing every instinct Horus had relied upon. The traitor host had not merely met resistance, it had been drawn into a war of attrition against the one brother who knew more intimately than any other how to make mass become liability. Furious messages went out from the War Master's bridge. Abaddon was ordered to break the inner rings at any cost. The assault formations were restructured. Restraint, where any remained, was abandoned. The response came in champions and butcher gods. Abaddon led the first of the great breaker assaults against the tightened palace rings. He came not with parade formations or wasteful declarations, but with chosen elites, assault claws, and the absolute intent to punch a path through whatever bastion, gun deck, or tunnel mouth stood in his way. He struck a central ring line in the western approaches, where the bulwarks had retracted and reformed so often that the ground itself had become a map of old deaths. Varn reached the sector by rail transfer under Valen's command, just as the counter-alarm began to howl through the underworks. The fighting there was close enough to smell. No broad front, no grand aerial vista, only bastion interiors, gun decks, trench mouths, collapsed transit wells, and galleries packed so tightly with men and smoke that the dead could not fall flat for lack of space. Abaddon's Justarin came through a breach cut by Melter and Chainfist, their black armor reflecting emergency lumens in hard, oily gleams. They fired on the move, disciplined as execution machinery, bolt shells punching men apart in fountains of red paste and ceramic fragments. Then they were in among the defenders, and the war lost even the pretense of distance. Varn saw an Iron Warrior's breacher split from throat to pelvis by a power talon, while still trying to drive a deep charge into the breech lip. He saw a Solar Auxilia lieutenant fire his sidearm point blank into a traitor's face, only for the return blow to drive the man's own jaw through the back of his skull. He saw bodies wedged in hatchways so thickly that advancing troops climbed them as steps, boots slipping in fat and blood. The walls of the gun deck sweated red from ricochet spray and ruptured men. Somewhere in that packed obscenity. Valen met a Sons of Horus champion in the half-dark and killed him by driving a boarding spike through his visor grill and out the back of his helm, only to lose 3 of his own to chain-blade bursts before the corpse had stopped twitching. Then Angron hit another ring line to the south, and the whole war seemed to scream in answer. Where Abaddon's assault was murderous discipline, Angron's was revelation by gore. The Red Angel hurled himself at a half-collapsed bulwark under cover of his legion's own bodies, using them as moving ablative matter against the guns. World Eaters flooded the impact zone, chain axes chewing at ferrocrete, at men, at the very idea of ordered defense. Through smoke lit orange by promethium, Varn saw Angron only in fragments relayed from forward-picked feeds before each feed died in static and blood. A red armored giant wreathed in arterial mist, axes falling like execution hammers, imperial fists reduced to flying ruin. An Iron Warrior's gun team hacked apart so quickly that the loader's hands were still clamped on the shell cradle when the rest of him collapsed in strips. The intimate fighting spread through the ringworks like infection. Bastions became abattoirs, gun decks became charnel holds. Trench-line counter-assaults dissolved into men grappling in red mud with knives, entrenching tools, broken bayonets, cracked bolters used as clubs. There were no fronts in some stretches, only pockets of breathless murder, where the living crawled over the warm dead to reach one another's throats. Against this, Sanguinius became something beyond commander. He was not everywhere, but his presence was felt almost everywhere. Reports of the angel moving along the inner lines passed through the ranks like sacrament. Men half broken by plague, exhaustion, or terror found themselves standing straighter because they had seen him above the smoke, wings spread black-red in the firelight, or because a comrade swore by. All relics, he had landed upon a collapsing parapet and spoken a single sentence that made retreat impossible. He walked the Medici caverns, where the wounded lay in rows so long that the end of them was lost in incense haze. He descended into reserve trenches and spoke to mud-caked soldiers with blood on their faces and shell shock in their eyes, as though each was still worthy of being addressed by a Primarch. He launched aerial counter-strikes that turned despair into temporary fury. He was not soft. He did not promise survival. He made men believe their deaths might still signify something beyond digestion by the war. Perturabo, by contrast, never tried to make death bear meaning. He made it bear function. That contrast gave the defense its impossible breadth. Sanguinius inspired men to die. Perturabo calculated how many must. Between them, terror acquired both soul and method, and that combination proved harder to break than either alone. It cost the Iron Warriors dearly. The traps Perturabo had laid did not distinguish between noble blood and expendable blood once the activation runes were spoken. When a sector had to close, it closed. When a gallery had to collapse, it collapsed. When a firewall had to rise, it rose through whatever flesh happened to stand inside the chosen geometry. Often, it was the sons of Perturabo themselves who paid first and worst, because they knew the plans, knew the timings, and so were always nearest when one more impossible task had to be done inside the blast margin before the mechanism sealed. Varn saw Iron Warriors squads retake works they themselves had designed to become death traps, only to vanish when delayed detonations went up beneath them because the activation lattice could not be halted without compromising the wider kill band. He watched breacher teams force their way into trapped bastions to extract munitions or gene-coded lock cores, then lose half their number to the same retracting bulkheads and purge flames, meant for traitors. In a lower tunnel, redoubt 3 whole files of Iron Warriors were boiled alive when a magma vent was opened half a minute too early to prevent a World Eater's rush reaching the inner gate. Their armor cracked, their flesh ran, their screams turned metallic and then ceased. One limping sergeant, face half flensed and one eye gone, staggered out of that sector and spat on the floor of a reserve vault before demanding permission to return to the line. "Does the Primarch know?" Varn heard a Medici adept ask him, perhaps not realizing the question could wound. The sergeant's remaining eye burned like a furnace slit. He designed it. The critical dispute broke 2 days later, in a theater so crowded with men, armor, guns, and competing imperatives that even naming it a single battlefield felt dishonest. The enemy had forced deep concentrations there under cover of Death Guard contamination and breaker assaults led by Angron's surviving berserker masses. A whole war zone had become packed beyond sanity. Loyal defenders still held portions of the interior trench webs and under galleries. Reserve formations were moving through the rear. Wounded clogged the rail approaches. Munitions fields stood partly evacuated. Above and among them all, Angron and a corps of his legion were pressing toward an unstable but dangerous breach in the inner rings. Perturabo examined the lattice and gave the order none of them had wanted to hear. Collapse the whole basin. At first, some did not understand him. Then the hololith deepened, showing not merely a district, not merely a trench line or ring sector, but an entire war zone the size of a province, its foundations undermined by old quarries, magma faults, fuel reservoirs, rail tunnels, shell vaults, and demolition galleries placed over weeks of preparation. Dawn went still as extinction. There are loyal formations in that basin. Yes. Millions. Yes. There are still Imperial fists holding the third trench girdle. They will hold more usefully as overburden. Dawn moved so fast that mortal eyes almost failed to follow. His hand closed on Perturabo's breastplate and drove the Lord of Iron back a step, iron shrieking under the impact. The chamber erupted with drawn blades, barking warnings, the metallic slide of custodian spears lowering into ready line. "You will not spend them like rubble," Dawn snarled, face inches from his brother's. "Not mine, not Terra's." Perturabo did not strike him. Somehow that made the moment worse. He simply stared back with the absolute coldness of tectonic pressure. If Angron breaks through that basin intact, you will spend more than millions. You will spend the palace. They are our sons. They are already dead. Sanguinius stepped between them before the first blow could fall, wings spreading wide enough that for a heartbeat, he seemed almost a wall himself. Enough. Dawn's breathing was harsh, inhuman with suppressed fury. Perturabo's was not. The Lord of Iron looked past the angel to the hololith, to the red runes thickening in the basin, to the flow of enemy density, to the shrinking windows of opportunity. "Delay another 6 minutes," he said, "and the collapse loses half its effect. Delay another 10, and Angron crosses the central fault line." Jagatai, summoned by emergency vox, and still streaked with ash and speed, looked from one brother to the other, and then to the kill map. "Can you narrow it?" Perturabo's answer came after the barest hesitation, which in him was the equivalent of visible pain. "Partly. The Primarch may survive. More of ours may as well. More of the enemy, too." Dawn released him, as if the contact itself had become loathsome. "Do it," Sanguinius said, voice low, terrible, and exhausted. "Narrow it. Signal every withdrawal you can. Then do it." So they did. The basin. Collapse was only partial compared with Perturabo's original design. It was still one of the greatest deliberate slaughters Terra had yet endured. Warnings screamed through every channel. Some reached their recipients in time. Many did not. Reserve trains reversed in sparks and shrieking brakes. Men ran through trench webs, already beginning to crack beneath them. Imperial fists and iron warriors alike dragged wounded, ammunition carts, and one another toward any line marked marginally beyond the death zone. Angron's berserkers, sensing something in the ground, or simply exulting in the density of the killing, surged deeper instead of falling back. Then the charges went. The world opened. Varn saw it from a hardened observation slit, half buried in the outer rockcrete. An entire horizon convulsed downward, as if Terra itself had decided to swallow a piece of its own flesh. Trench lines, bastions, armored columns, plague cauldrons, gun nests, rail mouths, and screaming masses of men dropped into a descending apocalypse of rock, fire, fuel detonation, and shattered metal. Magma faults ruptured up through the collapse. Ammunition vaults burst inside the sinking ground and transformed it into a furnace from within. The basin became a continent of breaking ruin, then a volcano of debris and body parts, then a burning crater so vast that the smoke climbed into the cloud shell and blotted out whole sectors of sky. The shockwave knocked Varn from his feet and burst blood from lesser men's ears. Even sealed bunkers groaned under it. When he regained the slit and looked again, there was no basin. Only a mountain range of shattered earth still moving, still burning, still vomiting secondary detonations as buried stockpiles cooked off in sequence beneath the dead. They had buried Angron's assault beneath a world of rubble and fire. Whether the Primarch himself had perished, been entombed, or merely delayed, no one could say for many hours. The triumph was measured in mountain ranges of dead. Afterward, Even the strategium fell quiet. Dawn stood rigid and ashen, his fists wet with blood where his gauntlets had bitten into his palms. Perturabo looked at the crater returns and said nothing at all. For once, no one accused him. The scale had passed accusation. Sanguinius closed his eyes as if listening to some choir no mortal could hear and wished did not exist. Varn thought then that perhaps the silence of the Emperor was the most merciless thing of all. To make sons choose such acts and offer neither absolution nor condemnation was a cruelty beyond artillery. The partial collapse bought Terra time. That fact was not in dispute. Angron's thrust vanished into ruin. World Eater's pressure in the central approach disintegrated. Death Guard support concentrations were torn to shreds. Fresh traitor assaults hesitated before the crater belts, uncertain at last whether any ground taken on Terra could be trusted to remain ground. The counter-siege tightened further, and on the vengeful spirit, Horus abandoned what little restraint had survived the long murder of brotherhood. He saw now with intolerable clarity that time no longer favored him. The war on Terra was becoming precisely the kind of grinding attrition Perturabo had once existed to win for the War Master, not to inflict upon him. His landed armies were being segmented, starved, bled, and made to consume themselves under the pressure of a palace that had learned to kill inward as well as outward. Every day of delay widened that truth. Every hour gave Dawn more shape, Sanguinius more legend, Jagatai more roads to cut, and Perturabo more corpses with which to write mathematics. So Horus chose acceleration. Orders went out not for measured pressure, but for final gambles. More warp was invited, more champions unleashed, more restraint cast aside. The coming assault would not be prudent, elegant, or even sane. It would be everything the rebellion still possessed, hurled toward decisive rupture before the counter-siege could finish strangling its own invaders. On Terra, the guns did not cease. The trains still ran beneath the palace, carrying shells, bodies, and replacements through the dark. The crater basin still burned like an open wound in the world, and all who understood the war understood this as well. The next stage would not be a continuation, it would be a convulsion. By the hour of Horus's final gamble, Terra was no longer a throne world in any sense that old men of the Imperium would have recognized. It was a carcass still firing its guns. Its oceans had become slow-moving graves choked with ashfall, promethium runoff, chemical slurries, and the swollen dead. Hive cities beyond the primary palace belts were gutted to their bones, their upper spires burned black, and their underlevels collapsed into burial vaults packed with uncounted millions. Labor populations that had once fed the defense with hands, lungs, and obedience had been consumed almost to extinction. The fortress rails beneath the palace still screamed without cease, but half the trains now ploughed through supply tunnels clogged with dead servitors, flayed soldiery, shattered crawler units, and piles of spent shell casings knee-deep in blood-slick mud. Even the imperial palace itself, the heart of old Terra, had ceased to resemble a seat of majesty. Its walls were smoke-blackened, its towers were bitten open by bombardment, its plazas were crater fields, its gates were steel jaws caked in soot, marrow, and powdered stone. It stood not as a symbol of empire, but as a mausoleum that refused burial. Acast Varn had survived long enough to stop wondering why. He moved through the inner underworks with the exhausted steadiness of a man who had long ago spent every finer feeling available to him, and now continued forward out of habit, command, and some final hateful instinct against the enemy. His coat of authority had been burned away days earlier. His left arm was splintered in steel and wrapped in field dressings gone brown beneath fresh seepage. His rebreather filters tasted permanently of corpse smoke. Around him, through the deep vaults and loading caverns beneath the palace, the last reserves of Terra streamed toward the upper breaches in endless battered files. They marched past shell stacks taller than hab blocks, past body carts piled with men too broken for identification, past shrine alcoves where priests with blood on their faces daubed machine oil and sacred ash upon weapon housings while reciting benedictions in voices cracked raw. Iron warriors marched there, imperial fists marched there, solar auxilia remnants, skitari with rusted augmetics and human skins split at the joints from radiation burns, men whose eyes were gone beneath bandages and who still carried rifles because no one had been spared to take them away. No one spoke much any longer. Speech had become a thing for commands, coordinates, and death. Notices. Above them, the final assault descended. The order to board the Vengeful Spirit had not been made public among the ranks in any full sense. Only fragments drifted down the channels between one emergency and the next. The War Master's shields had lowered. A chance, perhaps the last, had been grasped. The Emperor had made his decision. Somewhere beyond the burning cloud shell and the grave litter of the Void War, the Master of Mankind had gone to face the Son who had murdered the age. Yet even that vastness, that apocalyptic duel toward which all history seemed to strain, did not stop what still came crashing against the inner sanctums of terror. The traitor remnants knew the same thing the Loyalists did. Time had narrowed. If the War Master was to seize victory, the palace below must be torn open now, before the truth above found its shape. And so everything that remained of the landed host was driven inward in one final convulsion of hunger, fanaticism, plague, madness, and spite. The last breaches became the true hidden climax of the war. They opened along the inner sanctum approaches in a series of shattered ring failures, not total breaks, but wounds deep enough to spill the enemy into ground that should never have known their tread. Through them came the dying core of Horus's dream, berserkers starved half feral from weeks in the trap lines, Death Guard survivors weeping filth through the cracks in their armor, sons of Horus chosen in blackened plate, still disciplined even after all that had gone wrong, word-bearers chanting as if their throats were altars, mutant thralls and half-birthed warp abominations driven forward with knives and icons. They came by trench and vault, through collapsed gun galleries, over body ramparts, across rad-scorched bulwarks, and up through breach wells slick with old blood and fresh masonry dust. And at those breaches stood Rogel Dawn and Perturabo. Varn saw them together for the last time in the upper redoubt, chambers behind the Eternity approaches. The strategium there had been reduced to a ruin with cogitators. Hololith projectors sparked in and out amid smoke. Entire sections of the chamber had been opened to the air by bombardment, letting in ash gusts and the stink of the burning city below. Dawn stood bareheaded, hair clotted with dust and blood, his armor cracked in a dozen places and blackened almost to bronze. Perturabo stood beside him, broader than a gatehouse, iron plates seared, one shoulder guard torn nearly free, hazard chevrons half buried beneath soot and the flesh mist of recent fighting. They did not look like Primarchs from triumphal statuary. They looked like the last functioning engines in a world of ruin. Dawn studied the final breach runes and said, "If the western sanctum line folds, the enemy reaches the inner vault mouths." Perturabo's gaze never left the projections. "Then the western sanctum line will fold by our hand, not theirs?" Dawn gave him a look heavy with old poison and fresh understanding. "You still speak of surrender as if it were a weapon." "It always was," said Perturabo. There was no time left for outrage, only utility. Orders went out, reserves shifted, tunnel mouths were sealed and opened in sequence. Buried guns rose and fired until their barrels glowed cherry white, and then burst. Fortress rails coughed replacement troops into galleries already knee-deep in their predecessors. Fire curtains ignited behind traitor spearheads, cutting retreat even as the enemy pressed forward. Magma vents opened in lower breach caverns and turned entire underlevels into screaming furnaces. Every ring of the palace that still possessed coherent function constricted. And then the enemy hit in full. Varn was thrown into the fighting at the western inner breach, beside a mixed line of imperial fists and iron warriors, who had long ago run out of reasons to hate one another in any active sense. The hatred remained, old, and sour and ineradicable, but exhaustion and necessity had buried it under heavier truths. Men died in silence there, or with only their target calls spoken. An imperial fist passed Varn a fresh charge pack without looking at him. An iron warrior dragged a wounded son of Dawn out of a killing lane by the gorget and shoved him toward medici recesses without a word. Another pair, one in yellow and one in iron grey, fought back to back atop a mound of dead thralls until both vanished beneath a fresh rush and the mound became merely higher. That silence was more terrible than any shouting. It was the silence of men who had no energy left for contempt. The breach itself had once been a ceremonial processional way, lined in stone saints and bronze aquilae. Now it was a ruptured throat, lined in molten statuary, and the remains of at least 4 prior assaults. Traitor bodies lay in drifts so thick that the living ran over them. The defenders fired down until the barrels smoked and then fought at arm's length among shell bursts, plague vapors, and flying shards of sanctified masonry. Varn shot one man through the eye slit of his helm and clubbed another with the rifle stock when the mechanism jammed. A berserker caught him across the ribs with a chain-axe blow that should have opened him to the spine, but the teeth bit a fallen cuirass plate first and turned the strike into a ragged, screaming ruin instead of instant death. He remembered little after that, except rolling in hot blood and getting up because the line still existed, and that fact required his body. Over the roar came another sound, impossible to mistake even in that age of horrors. Sanguinius. The angel descended through the shattered upper air above the breach, with his wings black-red in the smoke glare, his armor bright with fresh slaughter, and where men had been failing they rose again. Varn could not hear the words he shouted, only the shape of their effect. The defenders surged. Astartes and mortals alike threw themselves forward with the last reserves of strength available to flesh. Sanguinius was the spiritual center of the defense made visible, not because he promised salvation, but because he made damnation feel worth resisting. Wherever he struck, the traitor press buckled. Wherever he passed, dying men tried once more to stand. Yet even the angel's presence did not decide where bodies must fall. That remained Perturabo's office. The Lord of Iron moved along the inner line, not in some remote sanctum, but in person, entering breach zones under bombardment, redirecting gun crews, ordering detonations with his own Vox, and once, when a Death Guard push threatened to wedge a permanent lodgment inside the third ring, personally leading an Iron Warrior's counter-assault through a collapsing tunnel redoubt. Varn saw him there only in flashes through smoke and emergency lumen strobe, a giant in iron, wreathed in dust and shell glare, smashing traitor legionaries from the path with hammering mechanical violence, while issuing firing corrections to artillery 3 levels above, as if the 2 acts were branches of the same thought. Dawn fought differently. Where Perturabo moved like deliberate machinery, Dawn became pure, grim refusal. He held breach mouths himself when the line wavered, blade and bolter speaking with brutal exactness, his presence a rebuke to collapse. More than once Varn saw yellow-armored survivors steady, simply because their Primarch still occupied the impossible point and thus made abandonment unthinkable. Together, they held the final breaches. Together, they preserved the Emperor's hour. That was the truth Varn understood, with the strange clarity only exhaustion can grant, not purity, not the clean nobility the remembrancers would later hunger to inscribe into history, not even faith alone, though faith had mattered. Terror endured because men had accepted calculations too monstrous to commemorate, because one brother would not yield a wall and another would not hesitate to turn the city behind it into ammunition, because the defenders had buried their own, burned their own, poisoned their own, and reduced sanctity to geometry, wherever geometry bought another hour for the throne. Above, somewhere beyond the shield glare and burning void, the Emperor faced Horus. Below, the palace remained shut, only because monstrous methods still had hands to operate them. The moment of change was not signaled by triumph. It came first as hesitation. The traitor assaults, which had hammered without cease, suddenly lost a certain awful cohesion. Vox chatter from intercepted channels shifted from commands to confusion. Some enemy spearheads pressed on with the frenzy of the damned, but others faltered, as if a pressure somewhere outside themselves had changed shape. Word-bearer chants broke cadence. Sons of Horus kill teams that had advanced with murderous precision now paused to seek orders that did not come. Even the berserkers seemed, for instants at a time, directionless in their fury. Then the reports began to descend. Fragmentary at first, contradictory, impossible. The War Master's flagship had changed status, shield signatures destabilized. Command hierarchies aboard traitor vessels were in collapse. The name of Horus passed through the channels like a wound no one yet dared touch. No official proclamation sounded through the palace. No glorious vox burst announced the death of the arch-traitor in words fit for statues. The truth arrived instead in the way all battlefield truths do, through disruption, through panic, through the sudden failure of one side's will to remain a coherent blade. Horus had fallen. The traitor advance did not end nobly. It came apart. Some of the enemy fought on in disbelief, or because madness had replaced all higher command long ago. Others began to withdraw the instant their instincts grasped the void above had changed forever. Death Guard elements retreated in poisonous order where they could. Sons of Horus formations either broke for whatever extraction routes remained or turned rabid with cornered spite. World Eaters died where they stood or charged into gunfire until nothing remained of them worth naming. Whole thrall masses simply collapsed into leaderless animal terror and were cut down by the thousands. Across Terra, the surviving hosts of treachery either fled, disintegrated, or were hunted into extinction among the ruin belts. Victory smelled like opened intestines left in the sun. Varn walked the aftermath of the Western Breach 2 days later and found no word for what he saw that did not cheapen it by pretending language was equal to the labor. Districts smoldered, trenches steamed with rot, charnel processors worked without pause and still fell behind the volume of dead. Entire stretches of the palace approach had become red-black flats where no architecture remained distinct from the flesh around it. The carrion, servitors jammed constantly because ligaments, shell belts, and snapped weapon straps tangled in their intake gears. Men coughed blood into already blood-dark mud and called it a good sign because it meant they still had blood to cough. This was victory. A charnel empire of smoldering districts and uncountable dead. And already, even before the pyres had thinned and before the last hunted traitors were fully cleared from the underworks, the forgetting had begun. Not true forgetting. Never that. Something more deliberate. Records of certain demolitions vanished into sealed vaults. Casualty ledgers from the sacrificial sectors were restricted, redacted, or simply lost in bureaucratic cremation. Official narratives praised Dawn's indomitable defense, Sanguinius's holy martyrdom, the Emperor's final sacrifice, the courage of the palace garrison. All of that was true. It was not the whole truth. The whole truth stood in the open air upon a wall no remembrancer wished to paint. Perturabo was there when Varn saw him, after the war had formally tipped beyond recovery for the traitor cause. The Lord of Iron stood alone upon a ruined battlement, overlooking the wasted approach belts. Smoke moved around him in long black streamers. Beyond him, terror smouldered to every horizon. No crowd hailed him. No officers came with laurels, seals, or oaths of grateful remembrance. Custodians passed him with unreadable faces. Palace adepts kept their distance. Even the imperial fists who crossed that wall gave him only hard glances and silence. Suspicion clung to him more stubbornly than soot. His methods were feared. His necessity was resented. Many on Terra had already decided, without ever speaking it aloud, that it would be better for history to remember Rogel Dawn's nobility than the Lord of Iron's utility. One inspired trust in the story the Imperium wished to tell about itself. The other exposed the machinery underneath that story, and the machinery was ugly enough to make devout men nauseous. Dawn came to that same wall before dusk. He looked 10 years older than he had at dawn. There was no victory in him, only damage held upright by duty, and whatever grief could not yet find room to be fully suffered. He stood beside Perturabo, and for a long while neither spoke. Beneath them, the fields of death smoked. Somewhere far off, a delayed ammunition vault ignited and sent up a new flower of orange fire from a district that had already burned 3 times. At last Dawn said, "You were right." There was no gratitude in it. The words sounded like broken stone. Perturabo did not turn his head. "Yes." Dawn's hand tightened on the parapet until the old stone cracked. "I hate that." "I know." They stood in silence again. It was not peace. It was something colder, and perhaps more enduring. Varn watched from a respectful distance and understood, with the finality of revelation, the shape of the thing history would refuse. Perturabo had remained loyal. Perturabo had helped save the Imperium. Perturabo had been right about siege war in the way only a man can be right when his truth is sharpened into atrocity. And none of that had made him loved. None of it had even made him trusted. He was still what he had always been in the eyes of too many, a weapon employed because the age required it, then set aside because no one wished to admit what the age had asked of it. Keir Valen died 3 days later, clearing the last sealed traitor hold fast beneath the northern rail vaults. No statue was raised for him. No anthem took his name. Acast Varn signed the reclamation form himself and watched the ink dry over a designation that reduced the Centurion to function completed and losses acceptable. Years later, when the histories were recited in cleaner halls and with fewer pauses for disgust, Varn would hear men speak of the siege of Terra as though it had been one pure thing, a wall of heroes, a shining refusal, a martyrdom, illuminated by righteousness and redeemed by the Emperor's final triumph. He would say nothing. Because he had seen the siege no one talked about. He had seen supply tunnels clogged with flayed men and shell carts rolling over the dead to keep the guns fed. He had seen loyal districts mined with their wounded still inside. He had seen imperial fists and iron warriors die shoulder to shoulder in mute hatred turned to necessity. He had seen the palace turned into a layered machine of consumption. He had seen the Imperium preserved not by innocence, but by calculation so cold it bordered blasphemy, and by cruelty so disciplined it could still call itself duty. That was the truth beneath the monuments. Terra had won. Terra had also been spiritually mutilated in the act of surviving. And perhaps that was why no one spoke of this hidden siege, except in fragments, sealed annals, and the nightmares of the few who had stood close enough to smell it. To tell the whole truth would be to confess that the Imperium had been saved by methods too near the darkness it claimed to resist, that the line between loyalist necessity and traitor monstrosity had not always been a wall of gold and certainty, but often a smear of ash and blood over broken stone, that brothers who despised one another had preserved mankind precisely because their hatred would not permit surrender. The palace bells rang that night over a victorious world. They sounded less like celebration than mourning. And on the blackened walls of the throne world, with no one cheering and no hymn fit to sanctify the sight, Perturabo stood beneath the burning sky, as unloved as ever, another engine of war left running after the battle, because no one yet knew how to face what it had done for them.